show is indeed what we're going to have, right, Michael?
Hopefully.
Nate, thank you for setting all the technical background for this call, and thank you all our participants, viewers, listeners who joined us today. We're coming together on the heels of Israel's 72nd Independence Day, celebrated yesterday, to learn about annexation, the implication of annexation, a move which will fundamentally alter Israel as we know it, which is why J Street sees a huge priority in both educating ourselves about what annexation means and mobilizing ourselves as well to fight it. In recent weeks, it has become very clear that the Israeli government shall it be established, and that there's still some percentage chance of that not happening. Then it plans to move forward on annexation. We don't know exactly in which form. There are different options for the size of the territory, the procedure in which annexation will take place. So that is still an unknown. But the annexation, as we said in several conversations in the past, is part of the coalition agreement. So there's a green light in a way by this government for it to move forward, which is why we are holding a series of calls around annexation, each looking at different implications and elements. We already had a call that examined the security implications for Israel. We had a call that looked at the different scenarios of what's going to happen. And today we're going to focus on the legal implications. And with us is the really number one expert in Israel on this issue, Michael Sfard, who's a lawyer with background and expertise in international law, human rights law, I should say, and laws of war, with a special emphasis on law of belligerent occupation. He's extremely busy, and I'm sure that today, while he's briefing us, he already briefed a few other people today. So let me take this opportunity first, both Michael, to thank you for making the time to talk to us, as well as thank you for all your work that you're doing throughout your really amazing career to fight occupation, and specifically around the issue of annexation. I will start with introducing you with some points, because I have to give honor and credit to your experience. And then we'll start really with an opening question. I very much welcome all your questions. Please put them in the Q&A box or on Facebook, and we'll just navigate the conversation according to your questions. Sfard led a number of cases, many of them I'm sure you know about. Let me just mention two: litigation for removal of settlements from private Palestinian land. Migron and Amona might be names that you're familiar with. Petitions concerning the separation barriers. I'm sure you heard about the cases of Bil'in that he led, as well as other cases regarding confiscation of land, targeted killing, and other implications of the occupations. He's also a legal advisor to a number of Israeli human rights and humanitarian organizations, including Yesh Din, Peace Now, Breaking the Silence, Human Rights Defenders Funds, and others. He also represents Palestinian communities and Israeli and Palestinian activists, and advises to international human rights organizations. He grew up in Jerusalem, served in the IDF. We have to mention the story for those of you. I'm sure many of this call had the opportunity to visit in Hebron, which is something that J Street does with its groups, and is highly recommended for people coming to the region. So Michael was a conscious objector to serve in Hebron and sat 3 weeks in jail for it. He was also awarded the Emil Greenspike Human Rights Award in 2012 for his work, and a fellowship with the Open Society Foundation, which he used to research human rights litigation in Israel on issues related to the occupied Palestinian territories. He has a wonderful book, which I highly recommend reading if you want to get the details of really how the system works, which is titled in English, Michael.
It is The Wall and the Gate, Israel, Palestine, and the Legal Battle for Human Rights. The Wall and the Gate.
The Wall and the Gate. Thank you very much also for writing it. So we, as I said at the beginning, want to talk about the legal implications of annexation. Yesterday, Senator Bernie Sanders tweeted, Israel annexation of the occupied territory clearly violates international law. An outcome in which Palestinians are denied equality, freedom, and self-determination, and an affront to our values and interests. It should not be supported by the United States. So let me open our conversation with a straightforward question. From a legal standpoint, how is annexation of any part of the West Bank different than the current situation? We're post-Pesach, so we should ask, Ma nishtana, what will change? I think people who are following occupation already know that Israel fails its obligations under international law and extensively violates Palestinian human rights. So how will annexation make that reality different? Let's start with the legal framing implications, and then we'll talk maybe in the second round about the implications on the ground. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yael. You were much too kind in describing my past. I asked myself, who are you talking about while you were talking? And if I may say, I can't think of a better way to exploit my time than to give a presentation or briefing to J Street. I think J Street has and will have a crucial role in whatever will happen when it comes to annexation in the next months, and actually we are getting to the money time. So I see J Street as one of the biggest partners in the struggle to stop the annexation. So yeah, I'll start with saying a few things about law. I will not be too legalistic, but I think it is very important to understand the magnitude of the paradigmatic change that annexation will bring if happens. And one must realize that international law goes hand in hand with international relations. A change in status in legal status many times is the reactor that generates the energy for changes in the international relations realm. So I know that many people who joined this this conversation ask themselves, even if there is a big change in legal terms, what is the implications of this? So I'll get to that later, but I just want to say, think of it not only in the terms of legal institutions, courts, etc., and law enforcement. Also, in that stage, but big changes in legal terms affect very much immediately international relations. And what we're seeing in the last few years is a tectonic change, really a paradigmatic change, as I said before, in the way that the government of Israel understands the nature of its own domination over the West Bank. I will not talk about Gaza Strip, which is a different story, a very complex one, where there is a siege already for 13 years, and a partial or a very unique type of occupation over there. And I will not talk about East Jerusalem that was already annexed in the past. I'll talk about the West Bank, and later on, if we'll have time, we can get to Jerusalem or Gaza. But for 50 years, since 1967 and until 2017, all Israeli governments, each and every one of them, from the Labour Party and Likud, from Menachem Begin to Netanyahu, have all had the same understanding regarding or at least the same, not understanding, but the same kind of declarations to be made to the international community as to the nature of our rule in the West Bank. And while the international community was very clear that Israel is an occupier, an occupation is not something illegal, it's a status, and Israel is the occupying power of the West Bank. Israel denied that it is an occupying power. It denied that the nature of the regime there is an occupation for legal reasons which were not accepted and completely dismissed, completely in a very rare consensus by the international community. But Israel at the same time said that it accepts that the West Bank is what it termed as disputed territories. Now, if you would log on the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website today and search for the words occupied territories, you'll find an explanation that is still today on the website explaining why Israel thinks it's not occupied territories, but rather disputed territories. Now, what does it mean, disputed territories? What is this concept? It's not a legal term. Disputed territories is not a legal term. Unlike occupation, where you have laws of occupation, you don't have laws of disputed territories. Disputed territories is a political term. And it says the following. It says, we acknowledge that this territory, that there are several parties who have claims to this territory. We have claims. What are the nature of the claims? Well, this is something that was different between different Israeli governments, but we have claims. We know that others have claims. And so there is a dispute. And we acknowledge that disputes in international, under international law have to be resolved through negotiations and consent or through arbitration or adjudication, but not by force, not unilaterally. So basically, the governments of the State of Israel since 1967, and you should read the speech the Israeli foreign minister of that time, Abba Evan, gave at the Security Council on the 22nd of November of 1967, the day that Resolution 242 was adopted by the Security Council. He says exactly this. We have claims, but we understand that there are others who have claims, and we will resolve this in negotiations. And the permanent status of the West Bank would be decided in an agreement. And the international community accepted that. That was the premise, that Israel is not a pariah state. It does not throw away the basic principles of the international legal order that was set up by after the Second World War in the UN Charter. So that was the position during those 50 years, 1967 to 2017. Mind you, that on the ground something completely different happened, and Israel completely changed the territory and colonized it and perpetuated its presence there. So while it was declaring that it accepts that its management or its presence or not presence, but the domination over that territory in military regime is temporary and subject to these negotiations and eventual agreement, it did something completely different on the ground. It perpetuated its presence and domination for long term. Now, this happens quite often in international relations and even in international law, that words are taken much more weight than deeds. And the international community was adhering to the words of the Israeli government. And that was the premise throughout those years. What we saw in beginning, it was in May of 2015, when the fourth Netanyahu government was sworn in, the most right-wing Israeli government Israel has ever had, on a meter that measures its positions regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Things have changed. In 2007, but between 2015 and 2017, the Israeli government was held by a majority that was not agreeing to the concept of the West Bank as a disputed territory, and was aiming and pursuing annexation. But that was a non-starter, because in Washington there was a guy that would not allow this. And the Obama administration, of course, would not hear about annexation. But in February of 2017, in January, when Trump was sworn in, then Israel officially began pursuing a policy of annexation. And that means, and this policy of annexation went in different ways. A gradual de jure annexation by chunks of Israeli law being applied territorially to the West Bank by the Knesset, by the Israeli parliament, where Palestinians have no representation and cannot vote for or be elected. And also, recently, with the idea of an all-out annexation by one legislative act that will apply Israeli law and sovereignty in one go on a certain part of the West Bank. And Netanyahu said that we are planning on a gradual annexation, because he understands that all of the West Bank cannot be swallowed in one go. And so he began talking about the Jordan Valley and later on other parts of the West Bank. This means, and this is where I'm getting at, and that is the legal change that we're seeing, that Israel no longer is, or the Israeli government is no longer pursuing a policy of negotiations, and its presence in the West Bank is no longer seen by itself as temporary. And this is huge. This is huge for many reasons. It is huge because it means that Israel is completely rejecting the two major principles of the international legal order of post-Second World War. And the principles are that you cannot annex territory that was occupied by force. And this is part of the most important principle that was anchored in the UN Charter, that international relations cannot be pursued by force. Force is illegal, and that is maybe the most dramatic change of international law after the Second World War. Use of force and use of threat of force was outlawed, except for self-defense. And with it, annexation, forcible annexation by force was outlawed, because if you are allowing nations to exploit economically occupied territory or annex it, then you're giving a good reason to start wars. And so that is one thing. And the second thing is that Israel basically also declares that it would not respect another major principle of international law and international relations starting at the beginning of the second half of the 20th century, and that is the right of peoples to self-determination. The same right that was at the basis of the establishment of the state of Israel itself is now being denied officially and forever, because annexation is an eternal act, right? And so if we annex parts of the West Bank, and we by that create a reality which would not leave any room for a Palestinian entity that materializes the right of the Palestinian people for self-determination, we violate and we breach a principle that was again anchored in the post-Second World War international order and ended 400 years of colonial power. So this is the magnitude of things. If the world allows the annexation, it has to ask itself, why does it object to the annexation of Crimea by the Russians, of Western Sahara by the Moroccans, of Tibet by the Chinese? It's not only about us. It's something that the international community will have to look into, because it is a very, very significant violation of a fundamental principle under international law. One last thing about law. Maybe I don't know if we'll have time to get to this later. And I will say that very delicately. Israel, from the early years of its existence, was constantly escorted by a charge that Zionism and the state of Israel, as was formed, commits the crime of apartheid. And these were very radical, fringe voices that were saying these things. And after 1967, this charge was a little more powerful because there is an occupation, domination over a group. We've colonized the territory. Our settlement project brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis. And so now we have two communities in the West Bank living under different laws, one with all the connections and rights and civil rights and political rights and powers, and the other is completely stripped of their civil rights. And so this reality of domination and oppression of one group by another seems like something that reminds us of apartheid. But the apartheid analogy has a problem. And the main problem is that in order to commit the crime of apartheid, a state or a regime, it's not enough that it controls, dominates, and oppresses another people, but it also has to have a special intention of maintaining, perpetuating that domination, that inferiority for years to come, forever. And Israel always maintained that it does not have that intention, that we do not want to dominate the Palestinians, that we want to separate from them, that we want them to have their own future, and that the current situation is temporary and is subject to negotiations. And the peace process was a big proof that this is the intention of the governments of Israel. And now that alibi, which by the way can be second, it's not a very solid alibi given what is happening on the ground. But this alibi is now being shattered by Netanyahu and his, I would say, conspirators. Because if we are to annex territory, that means we do not see the domination of the Palestinian people as something that is temporary and subject to negotiations and eventually an agreement. We see it as a perpetual situation, reality. And we invite the voices that charge us with committing the crime of apartheid, not only to enter a more consensual circles and not just the small fringe, but we also invite them to say, if we are to annex and to create one regime with one and the same institutions govern here and there, then the charge of apartheid would also expand from saying you are committing the crime of apartheid in the West Bank to Israel is a state of apartheid, is an apartheid state. You're muted.
But it was good for the drama. Let me move to questions and really ask people. I see that you're sending questions in chat. I would really appreciate you writing your questions in the Q&A. There's two buttons at the bottom of the screen. One is the chat to give your comments and have conversation, and one is the Q&A from which I'm taking your questions. So I think in follow-up to your last point, and thank you for being so clear about these three, I think, implications that you described. logistically speaking, Jonah is asking, what would the implementation of annexation look like? What kind of a new infrastructure would it require? How long would it take?
Okay.
And
so
then let me just add to that another question, which is, if Israel annexes, it will officially discriminate against Palestinians on the basis of ethnicity, which connects to your last point, denying them with civil rights. Do you see a chance that they will be granted citizenship?
So thank you for these questions. We don't know what model of annexation is going, if our struggle to stop it would not be successful and some kind of an annexation act will be committed. We don't know which annexation the government will pursue. And to be honest, I think that it's not in Jerusalem that we have to look for the model, but in Washington, D.C. But in any event, it could be the Jordan Valley, it could be Ma'ale Adumim, it could be all the settlement jurisdictional areas, and it could be just a few settlement blocks, or it could be the whole of Area C. We don't know. So it is difficult to assess exactly what will be the implications. There are some things that we do know and we can say. One is that Israel will probably follow a kind of, you call it in America, gerrymandering. So a type of map of annexation that would have as much land as possible with as little number of Palestinians in it as possible. And if the number of Palestinians that will be caught in the annexed territory will be small, then Israel, for PR reasons, may grant them or offer them Israeli citizenship, because that would not endanger the demographics of Israeli citizenry. If, however, we'll have a big number of Palestinians in the annexed territory, then it is most likely that Israel will pursue the Jerusalem model. And I'm sure many of you know that after East Jerusalem was annexed, East Jerusalemites have been provided with a status of permanent residence with an option to apply for an Israeli citizenship. I think the numbers today are that in 50 years, 15,000 more or less Jerusalemites, East Jerusalemites, have applied for Israeli citizenship, and only a third of them, about 5,000, have received it. So it's a very, very devious way to present a bureaucratic obstacle for Palestinians, not to give them the citizenship automatically, which means that they will have to take an act that will be seen as disloyal to their people. And so this is what the kind of model that I think Israel would adopt. As for the implications on the ground, just a few words, and you can see my colleagues and I at Yesh Din, an Israeli human rights organization, we have published recently an information sheet that details the kind of issues that would be affected by, on the ground, by an annexation.
Sorry, to just a plug-in that J Street has, if you go to J Street's website, we have JStream, which will take you to a resource page with Yesh Din's report and other relevant documentation, as well as options for you to take action. Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
So the immediate implication to Palestinians from annexation would be probably, most probably, a massive land expropriation. Israeli law that will be applied there includes the Absentee Property Act, which nationalizes land that belongs to people who are not, that nationalizes property of people who are not in Israel and are in an enemy territory, or in parts of Eretz Israel that is not Medinat Israel, that is not the state of Israel. So if someone lives in Ramallah and has a parcel, a plot of land in the annexed territory, that land would be nationalized. Also, for the first time, Israel will be able to expropriate land under eminent domain. In the past, because of the laws of occupation, which were partially applied by Israel, you could not, the military civil administration could not confiscate land from Palestinians in order to build settlements. Now, it will be possible. Secondly, we are expecting massive forcible transfer of Palestinians residing in the annexed territory that are not acknowledged or recognized by Israel as legally residing there. So for example, it will take the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley has thousands of Palestinians living there, but Israel does not recognize their legal presence there, or most of them. So a small community will remain, but the others will be subject to forcible transfer. We will see a massive settlement development in the annexed territory because if that is sovereign territory of Israel, the local councils of the settlements would become regular local councils, city councils, etc., like any other city council in Israel. That means they will have a lot of executive power. You don't have that today in settlement localities. They are all subjected to military law, and the military, it's not a democratic apparatus. They could do whatever they want. As you all remember, during the Obama administration, there was a settlement freeze, right? You cannot freeze construction in Tel Aviv. It's just constitutionally, you can't do that to people because of political arrangements. So we'll see a lot of expropriation, we'll see forcible transfer, we'll see settlement development on speeds, really. And that is just the beginning. We'll see a problem of access to farmland, and depending on the exact location of the annexed territory, what would be with the movement of Palestinians from one side to another. This area becomes the state of Israel, so they need a visa in order to enter there. If the Jordan Valley is being annexed, then people who want to visit people in Ramallah or Jenin or Hebron need a visa to go through Israel in order to get there. This is all just the beginning. And as I said, Netanyahu says it's going to be a gradual annexation process. Now, the second question, could you remind me the second question?
Will the Palestinian be granted citizenship?
So I think I answered that.
Yeah. We have a number of legal questions. Let me try to bunch them together. Hopefully I get them right. Barbara Harvey, which says, hi, please cite the authority for principle that modern international law compels resolutions of land disputes between countries by negotiation. Yes? Let me throw a couple more there. Does annexation violate UN agreements to which Israel has committed itself legally? What would violation of these agreements imply? There's a very similar question regarding the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. So let's do those.
So yes, about land dispute. As I said before, the post-Second World War international legal order is set to avoid settling disputes by force. And there are all kinds of means of settlement dispute resolution under international law. And there is a list of them. You learn it both on international law courses and in international relations courses. It's good offices, it's negotiations, it's adjudication in international tribunals and courts, it's mediation. There's a set of dispute resolution means. And so land disputes are also such that are supposed to be entrusted with a dispute resolution mechanism and should not be resolved by force. Yes, Israel will violate international, not just agreement, but international law if it annexes a territory in the West Bank. As I said before, the prohibition on annexation is one of the most fundamental and important annexation of unilateral annexation of territory that was apprehended by force, is one of the most fundamental principles of international law after 1945, and it is anchored both in the Geneva Conventions that are the main or the backbone of international law of war and international laws of occupation, and in the UN Charter. What would be the implications of such violations? That's a good question. And I'm sorry we won't have enough time to talk about this. But you all know that there is, for example, a process in the International Criminal Court. Actually, today, the prosecutor has filed its response or rebuttal to all the amicus briefs that were filed to it. And in the coming weeks, a bench in the International Criminal Court will have to decide whether criminal investigations would be launched in suspicion that both Israelis and Palestinians have committed war crimes. Now, this question of whether we annex or not is directly putting pressure in the matrix of power that the ICC is at the center of. The ICC has a lot of pressure on it from allies of the State of Israel that are very powerful, Western Europe countries, and also, of course, the United States of America, not to deal with Israel, not to investigate Israel, not to allow indictment of Israelis in the International Criminal Court. On the other hand, we have the developing world, third world countries, what we quote unquote third world, that are pressing the court to stop being an Africa court, a court where only African war criminals are being tried. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that will determine the fate of the ICC and its character. And when Israel is pursuing annexation, that puts a lot of strain and pressure on the International Criminal Court judges, because this is exactly the type of mega violation of international law that they were set up to deal with. And lastly, about Egypt and Jordan. Yes, absolutely. The first sentence in the peace accords between Israel and Egypt, the first sentence in the preamble of the peace accords with Jordan, and the first paragraph in the Oslo Accords, they all state that Israel and that other party, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian and the PLO, are all in agreement that Security Council Resolution 242 must be realized. 242 says at the beginning that the Security Council repeats the very fundamental principle that occupied territory cannot be annexed and sovereignty cannot be acquired through force, and that Israel has to retreat from these occupied territories. Of course, it doesn't have to retreat from all of it if it reaches an agreement which allows it to remain in some of it. So it's definitely a violation of the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan and the Oslo Accords.
So on that, what is the role, Michael, that Israeli, that both the international, you talked about the ICC. So what is the role or the power that they have in regards to Israel as a reaction to annexation? And there's also a question about the role of the Israeli courts and their ability to restrict annexation.
So I'll start with the ICC. Annexation is illegal, and as I explained, I think several times today, it is a violation of settled, customary international law. But it's not a crime. We have to distinguish between illegal acts and illegal acts that are under international criminal law crimes, international crimes. Mm. The annexation itself is not an international crime. It's a violation of international law, and all states are obligated not to recognize that illegal step, which also brings us to the question of what would the world, especially Europe, that leads the policy of differentiation between Israel and the West Bank, that would challenge that policy very much. But we'll get to that maybe later. However, as I explained, the annexation itself may be not a criminal act, but it may give a lot of credence and power to the argument that Israel is now committing the crime of apartheid, which is an international crime. It's even, it is categorized as a more serious crime than war crimes. It's a crime against humanity. And so what we
I would just say in brackets that I think I didn't know until I understood that from you, that apartheid is not the specific, you know, only the specific regime that existed in South Africa, but actually a crime with a definition in international law. So I'm just like highlighting that.
This is very important. I sometimes forget to mention it. It's very important. Apartheid, of course, is a historic regime, but throughout the years, international law evolved in a way that apartheid now is an independent concept. It's an international crime. It has been formulated at least in two major international treaties. The International Treaty for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid from 1973, and the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court and basically its statute. And in both treaties, there is a definition of the crime of apartheid. The crime of apartheid is committed when, in a context of, well, as I said before, of a group dominating and oppressing another group systematically, and with the intention of maintaining that domination and oppression. And the groups are based on nationality or race or color, etc. So it is an international crime of the kind of international crime against humanity. So when we're talking about what the court may do, it may open an investigation into this crime, of course. I don't know if it will happen, because we first have to deal with what is already on the court's docket, and it took 5 or 6 years before that one is reaching the decision-making phase. But that is an option. As for the Israeli courts, look, if annexation will pass Israeli parliament, then I don't see the Israeli courts intervening in that. The Israeli judiciary, as I'm sure you all know, is under a unprecedented attack by the Israeli right. It is being cornered. I mean, it went through a very significant change in the last few years, with the old guard that sees itself as protecting a liberal democracy becoming a minority in the court. And today, the Israeli Supreme Court, what it does is mainly protecting the rules of the game. You know, that the executive would not tramp the judiciary, the legislator, and things of that sort. And if the legislator, a clear majority in the Knesset, would vote for annexation, I don't think that the Israeli court would intervene. It might demand, it might allow petitions that deal with the status of Palestinians who live in the annexed territory, but not more than that.
Thank you, Michael. I have to mention, we have about 450 people at least on Zoom that are watching us, and I'm sure more on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And I'm so impressed and overwhelmed by the really informative questions that are based on people really knowing this issue. And I apologize if we won't be able to get to all of them, because we have 15 minutes. But the theme that I'm seeing in many of the questions has to do with what about Russia? Let's put it in a headline, both in terms of the repercussion of Russia's move. There was a question whether that the annexation of Crimea has bolstered Netanyahu to go for annexation. Did it give him more confidence? And also a question about the different places around the world instances where you mentioned annexation took place, I think the Israeli right is using actually as an argument to justify annexation. They're saying, you know, the world is uneven or unfair or treating Israel differently. Here are instances of annexation going in other places, and nobody's fighting against them. We're getting different treatment.
Whataboutism? Okay. The EU has declared sanctions on Russia because of the annexation of Crimea, which are still in force. But it's Russia. And yes, international relations, international politics, international law are very vulnerable to power. Not that domestic legal systems are not. I mean, I can think of a legal system where someone who has a lot of power not only can evade justice, also can shut down the courts with an excuse that there is a pandemic that doesn't allow the beginning of his trial. So power is something that twists justice, not only in international law. It also happens in domestic laws, in the domestic systems. And it does definitely happen in international law. And Russia is one of the major international powers. It has a veto power in the Security Council, which is the most powerful organ of the international community. And so, they can evade, maybe they can evade justice. And maybe we can evade justice too. I'm not proposing that that sanctions or any kind of penalties would be imposed on Israel for sure. I'm just saying, for me, this is not the issue. For me, the immorality of annexation, the immorality of the prolonged occupation, the immorality of setting out an apartheid reality, whether it is the crime or not, it's still a reality. This is what counts, and this is what I'm fighting. And I'm not trying to say that I know that because that there will be definitely consequences to this. And I don't accept completely, I reject completely the idea that Israel is facing different standards. I hope it does. I hope the world expects more than from us than it does from, say, Syria. I hope so. I wouldn't want to be judged on the same scale, but I am afraid that it's not true. Israel has been a consistent violator of international law in the last decades, and it had very little. There were very little implications to that, except condemnations from time to time, while other countries had suffered much greater implications from violation of international law. I remind you all that Saddam Hussein tried to occupy Kuwait and exploit the oil resources there, and what happened? Look, there are examples here and there. Israel is definitely not on the list of those who suffered for violations of international law.
As we come to a close, and again, thank you for all your questions. I think you've answered. There's been many questions about what do you anticipate, what do you expect will be the international reaction, and I think it's very hard to say. And of course, you mentioned bolstering of differentiation policies by the EU as just one example. We talked about the ICC, and we talked about other examples as well. But it's very hard to, if you're not a future teller, it's hard to say what will Israel do, what will be the level of annexation or the breadth of it, and what will be the reaction. What I think you can tell us is what do you think we should do? And what is your call for people who really care and are listening to you? We had some of this, again, just to give, to give some presence to the questions that I've been getting, asking what is happening today, whether there's more demolitions, more attacks in Area C, whether this atmosphere of annexation about to happen is being experienced differently on the ground. We won't be able to answer all of the questions, but there's a lot of interest. And I think the bottom line are people really wanting to hear from you what they can do, to stop annexation, to be helpful, both today, and maybe I'll actually also put the question forward, can it be reversed?
Well, the question of reversal depends on many factors. Everything is reversal except death, as we used to say. But the question is how much territory will be annexed and how much time will pass until the moment we are ready to reverse it. Because the longer it is annexed, the more facts on the ground are being laid. An act of parliament can be overturned by another act of parliament, but a house that is being built is very difficult to uproot. And land that is being confiscated and an olive grove that is being uprooted is very difficult to place back. So the question is how fast things would change on the ground. And I think that it would happen very rapidly. It will be like settlement expansion, as I said, on speed or an ecstasy. It will be very quick. So very quickly it will need huge amount of political capital and economic capital to overturn it. As to what we can do, so this is the money time. It is the money time. This is the time we have to do whatever we can. And I want to say that I don't think it's a done deal. We're closer to annexation than ever in Israeli history. But things are there are many factors that will play in the coming weeks and will determine whether it does happen, and if it happens, in what scale. It's no secret that the main backing, the main enabler of that act is President Trump. And of course, if President Trump will, and it seems that he will, and his staff will not only allow, but also encourage the Israeli government to go ahead with annexation, it is crucial that the person who's running in November against him will present a very vigorous position against annexation. Such vigorous position that would tell Israelis not only that it is a partisan issue, but that we are gambling here, because if we annex and then Trump loses, it will be a huge problem for us. That together with, so, I'm not an expert on how you mobilize things in American politics, but I'm sure the listeners and the people on this talk know much better than I do what should be done in order to make sure that at least the Biden relevant people are being pressured to do something and to say something, not just to say that they're against it, but more than that. We have to let Israelis understand what's at stake, because most Israelis, you know what, they wouldn't lose 1 hour of sleep whether we do an X or we don't. It seems to them like an act of masculinity, an act of power, of force. It shows that we are an empire. But if it means that we will suffer greatly from this, not just because there will be sanctions, but because the future of the state of Israel would be under jeopardy, as we want it to be. The future, as we all want it to be, is in jeopardy. That is also very important. So putting pressure on those parts of the coalition that are not in this for ideology. And of course, I'm talking about guns and and the labor. I can't believe that the labor is there, but the labor. These are parts of the coalition that have to be bombarded with pressure to do whatever they can to stop it. And I think that if they will realize, that this is an international relations nightmare, not just relations, but it puts Israel in a security, in a very tight spot when it comes to its position, moral and political position in the world. I think that they will maybe get cold feet and will do something about it. So we all have to do whatever we can, and especially J Street, because J Street is the arm that goes to the Hill. It's an existential thing for J Street. J Street was formed on the idea of supporting the two-state solution, and annexation is the end. Not the end, because it is, as I said before, it may be reversed, but it is definitely a major stone block that is being put to this vision.
Thank you so much. I don't think that I presented myself at the beginning of the conversation, just to say that I'm Yael Patir and I'm J Street's director in Israel. And I think that we are presented in as Michael said, we're presented with a moment. A moment that we've all those of us who have been following this closely understand creeping annexation, understand the policies of the right-wing government, what maybe we weren't sure about what they mean to do and do not get to. Michael was very helpful throughout the years with explaining to us, the outsiders, so to speak, about what are the plans, what does he see being passed in legislation under the title of creeping annexation, right? And the difference between the Euro annexation and de facto annexation, which is the reality, and the difference that Michael explained about the reality is changing, but we're now facing a moment. And I'm glad to say that in this moment, we have an infrastructure that we never had before, mainly in the US. Also in Israel, there's an active peace camp, there's an active human rights camp, there's less political parties opposing occupation than what we had before. But mobilization, I think, will happen all across the world. And J Street is very keen to do the best in our abilities with our audiences and target groups, and with your help to fight this this reality that is not a reality yet. And I welcome you to again educate yourself, to take action, to join us on JStream. Michael, we already have requests for another call with you, so we'll have to discuss that offline. But I'm sure that you'll have also other calls with the New Israel Fund and maybe other organizations that you will do in English, where people can really catch you again. And let me just
can I just say, we actually have a webinar with the New Israel Fund on May 6th next week. So
NIF webinar with Michael Sfard on May 6th. You're welcome to join. And if you have a question that you've asked and we didn't answer, and it's really like burning and you don't feel that it was answered, please send it to J Street's inbox, and I promise you that we will get you an answer. Michael Sfard, thank you so much for joining us, but mostly for everything that you do. Someone on the chat said that I was too modest about describing you and that you're a giant, in his words. You probably didn't see it, and I thought to myself, I know that you're modest, so I didn't want to embarrass you. But you have, I think, a lot of people that joined us today that I really, really appreciate your work, and I'm taking the opportunity to thank you on behalf of all of them. So have a good rest of the day. Be safe. Stay away from Corona. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.